There, everybody, and welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Jarrett Heights, and we are going to kick off a little bit of Azure this afternoon. How are we doing out there today?
Doing great, Jared. How are you? This is David Mitchell.
Hey, how's it going? I always like to kick off these sessions just with a little dose of feedback from you folks about what you were kind of hoping this would be. Obviously, we've got some materials prepared for you here today, but I also like to make sure that that is going to align fairly well with the best things that you can walk out the door with today. So, again, the first thing I want to just ask is if you could walk out of here with one thing today. And again, it doesn't have to be anything magical or special. Just, I'm curious, would it be, I know how to log in or subscribe to Azure? Would it be that I have a good generalized understanding of what what its basic functions are? What are you really hoping for from this hour?
Well, for me, I'm a system administrator, and so I work with Active Directory extensively, and servers, etc. So with introducing now these cloud services to our enterprise, I would like to know again, of course, be fluent in Azure, as well as what is it adding extra? Because I know I've been working Active Directory for about 20 years almost. So kind of know that pretty well. But what is Azure? This is again introduction for me, and I'm looking to get my certification on the 19th of May. I'm gonna work that.
Great.
But what is this adding to the Active Directory? It's I guess it's like a face on top of Active Directory somewhat. Am I correct?
Bad way to put it. Active Directory is an LDAP database, and Azure, which is now called Azure AD, is now called Entra because, it's a day ending in Y, so Microsoft had to rename something. But the underlying technologies that make these databases possible are actually very different, but they are designed to synchronize. They're designed to work with one another depending upon the extent of seamlessness you need with things like federated identity management, stuff along those lines. I will warn you that, we will address the existence of Azure AD, now Entra, today. But which class are you actually going to be taking with us? Are you thinking, is it going to be the fundamentals?
With the fundamentals, and then probably next year I'm going to move on to the administrator, but starting out with the AZ 900.
Gotcha.
That's the I'm trying to take to start.
That's actually a great kind of introduction to this as well, in that, like, what are your certification options moving forward? And the three biggies, the three tiers that Microsoft has introduced for Azure in kind of broad strokes is your Azure Fundamentals, which is very much I don't know cloud or cloud services very well yet. It hasn't been something I've professionally engaged with very much yet. And I'm interested in getting the basics. So in a very real way, this 1 hour that we're going to do here, I'm going to kick off here just in a moment, but that 1 hour is pretty much the outline of what you would get in your Azure Fundamentals class. And I don't want to overstate that, because there are definitely things that I won't get to today that will also be included in that class. But more important than probably almost any other aspect of what you get in that fundamentals place is, hey, I'm either new to the cloud or I haven't used Microsoft version of this yet. So it's going to walk you through the fundamental components of cloud infrastructure, in addition to then taking you into some of the, hey, what can I go do, and some high level demonstration. When you move from Azure Fundamentals into Azure Admin, you're taking a big leap. It's kind of going from 5th grade to an undergraduate degree, if you ask me. So there's not a good intermediary between those two. So my advice for people that are on that trajectory is, it's an excellent starting point. And I'm a big believer that Azure Fundamentals kind of is a good way to get a flavor for what Azure can do. That said, I don't think people walk out of that class going, let's go implement Azure. It's a great way to get comfortable with what it can do. It's not a good way to get comfortable with doing it. And so you're going to get way more of that hands-on component when you get into the Azure Administrator. It's also considerably more difficult from a certification perspective, but it's well worth it. I think that's the sweet spot. So definitely if you're brand new, Azure fundamentals is a great introduction, and it's going to give you just kind of that all-around big picture. Azure Admin, that's going to be your equivalent of an MCSA. If you're familiar with the days of that are sadly over, if you ask me, but we no longer have MCSAs and MCSEs. But that's probably the equivalent of a standard cloud administrator and the level of knowledge they'd be expected to have. So it's a pretty good one to pursue once you really kind of warmed up with the fundamentals material. Then you get into architecture, and architecture is where they get into the weeds. So this is going to be considerably more involved, considerably more specific. What kinds of particulars and variables are you adding into XML, IAC deployment files and things of that nature? So that's another fairly significant jump in terms of complexity. Those are a great, however, big picture outline for a educational and skill-based trajectory as you're moving into this stuff. You want to start with that, hey, what is this? Followed by what can it accomplish? Sometimes that's where people stop with Azure. They go, oh, what can it accomplish? I can't do the things I need it to do or in a way that I need it to do it. So it tends to not necessarily be an immediate good fit for everybody. Where migrating into a cloud service like Azure becomes beneficial to organizations is regularly on the financial side of things, which is often not what IT people are directly engaging with up front as well. So remember that if you are involved in a migration or a potential migration, that another major benefit to the cloud and kind of having a high level impression for what some of the things it can do include, one of the big leading ways you're going to get to a yes on things like Azure and other cloud services is usually the giant cost savings that comes with it up front. So we'll talk a little bit about how that shift comes into play and how it looks here, but I don't want to eat up too much more time because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to get into things. Any other preliminary considerations or remarks that might help me make this more beneficial for you here today?
It's a good start from right there, what you give me, for me.
Love it.
Yeah,
Good stuff. Well, let's get to it. Oh, I'm sorry. Go for it.
Yeah, I'm just here to basics. I'm curious. I'm just here for the basic functionality of it all. That's all.
That's a perfectly good reason to be here today. Like I say, you might very well go, oh, I don't need this at all. Or, wow, this can do 50 things that I've been dying for and just didn't know it was out there. So maybe something in between. Well, let's get to it. My name is Jarrett Heinz. I'm an instructor with the training camp. I'm in my 16th year providing a variety of different boot camps and boot camp services to them. I love teaching through them, and it's what I'd spend most of my real time either developing or delivering for. And I mostly focus on cloud and server infrastructure and security infrastructure. So I'm erring on the side of more of the security elements and components when it comes to deployment and usage of cloud services. But of the three major cloud vendors personally, although I have some light Google and AWS knowledge, Azure is definitely my favorite place to come back to in terms of cloud services. I actually feel like, and I don't probably have a generally better place to say this about a Microsoft product, this is about the most straightforward and well labeled and easy to navigate major cloud portal and the services that are offered therein that I'm aware of. And that's not to say that there aren't ways to incorporate graphical aspects of cloud infrastructure into other consoles and make it easier or more direct, or for that matter, to customize it for a particular administrator's workload. There's gobs of tools out there for that. But as far as just showing up and using Azure, it's relatively straightforward, not a particularly daunting introduction, I don't think. So what I want to do this afternoon for most of us, is get into what Azure can provide as far as what is cloud computing in very broad strokes. We're not going to spend a ton of time there, I promise. And then we're going to get into what the major functions and utilities involved in an Azure deployment entail. We're going to talk about the basic components of that. I don't want this to be a pure lecture. I want to spend a little bit of time demonstrating and showing that to you. So we're going to spend about 15 minutes making pretty quick work of just a quick once over of the major components. Variety of things like, again, what are the fundamental components of a cloud infrastructure in general, and then what specifically is Microsoft bringing to Azure in that vein, and then a little bit more about the particular services and resources that are added inside an Azure infrastructure that you can deploy on your own. So let's get to it. And by the way, please don't be shy about questions or feedback. You do not need to wait to the end unless it's detracting from our ability to fit things in the hour. I would much rather be answering questions and responding to things than just talking. So give me a heads up if there's something I can elaborate on or clarify as we go. We're going to start with just our overview information here. What is cloud computing? Generally speaking, cloud computing, the joke is always, well, it's just stuff running on somebody else's computer. And there's some-ish truth to that in some regards, right? Because what we do when we deploy a cloud data center is we build out the big three things that make a cloud: compute, storage, and networking capabilities, right? So compute is going to be your RAM and your processing power. Then we need some place to store it, and we need some place to move that traffic around. And if you think about it, everything that constitutes a data center or computing in general is really comprised of those three things. So that's not saying anything particularly amazing. What's interesting about the way that cloud presents those resources, though, is that they are offered instead of things you can walk into and buy. We're walking into a department store. There are a series of things that have been manufactured that have a price, and you can walk in and pick them and walk out the door. But in cloud computing, you can often walk in and pick the ingredients you want and mix them up in a customized way that's just for you. Right, so it's much more artisanal and a la carte than that. And yet at the same time, what makes this financially feasible for the likes of Microsoft in the first place is that they have an economic advantage in that, given their size, they can acquire and deploy things that other smaller organizations simply can't. And by virtue of that, they can go out and buy 10,000 hard drives at a fraction of the cost that it would take you or I to buy, say, 100. So they can turn around and pass that savings on to you by very effectively renting you the ingredients they bought, but they're also going to then turn around and go kind of mush things together in the way that you ask them to, and then hand you back a product you can use. So for example, I can say I need a certain amount of RAM and a certain amount of processing power, and that will return a virtual machine with a hard drive and an IP address. But it's a lot more than just building infrastructure, because as cloud environments have gotten more and more complex with each passing year, their offerings continue to increase, and the complexity of those offerings often increase along with them. For example, you can access a quantum computer through a conventional cloud connection now, something that, again, would be not only cost prohibitive, but probably skill prohibitive for most organizations. So cloud computing isn't just about renting somebody else's resources. It's about doing so in an efficient, resilient, and fundamentally cost-effective way, while also opening up a myriad of other potential technologies and capacities that would otherwise be too expensive or too difficult to do with our own on-prem folks and our own on-prem infrastructure. Not to mention, you get to pay for it as you go, and it scales incredibly well. The scaling component is unto itself one of the more compelling takeaways, because I can throw as much as I need up at a time on demand, what we generally refer to as the elasticity of the cloud. So if I need 10 more servers on Black Friday, they exist. And then when I don't need them anymore, I don't have to pay for them anymore. As soon as they are no longer a necessity, I no longer need to have them or have access to them. So those are kind of the big picture reasons why cloud computing introduces some significant value into a modern organization. I do want to stipulate one additional point of clarification. And that is, when I'm talking for the remainder of our time today about a cloud, I'm talking about a public cloud, as in Microsoft's public cloud offering. While there are such things as private clouds and community clouds, if we're to believe the textbooks, and even hybridized versions of these, we're not going to get into that or touch upon that other than this one aside, this little asterisk of a comment. So again, there's not a whole lot above and beyond in our conversation today about private computing, but you should be aware that that is an alternative option, and the compelling adoption of a private cloud computing circumstance is usually compelled by a need for extreme security while also having some of the cloud functions and features that we'll discuss. But it comes at a significant decrease in cost benefit, as well as, again, well beyond the scope of anything that you would typically do with the likes of Microsoft directly. Although there are governmental clouds that they have built on behalf of certain world governments, beyond that, you're usually either utilizing their public services in the regions they provide, or you're not. It's a one or the other for most organizations. Azure provides a platform that allows you to gain access to all the resources that they make available through a variety of different regions. So there's this huge global network. 60 different regions across the globe means that there are that many dedicated, redundant data center opportunities, and this diversity in location, as well as diversity in service, gives us a means of storing things that are not only highly resilient, a lot of redundant components, it's easy to make multiple copies for redundant purposes, but also we can make an entire infrastructure deployed in one region mirrored with another. So we can create redundancy within a data center, within a region of data centers, and even across regions. So our capacity for high availability is significant as a result. And then there's just a bunch of things, again, that you can do, like quantum computing, like data warehousing, and a series of different AI-based, now significantly more so with LLM and more Copilot coming along all the time, way more AI-integrated services and supplemental tools than have ever existed before. So we get fantastic standard Microsoft enterprise-grade security, as well as the robust history of a company like Microsoft, who's already very good at compute, who has a long history with operating systems, are now bringing that into the cloud and expanding those capacities and capabilities to not only other organizations, but they're also in a competitive market. So they're driving their capacities all the time to be as good or better than the competition. And this does nothing but benefit us, because it means that while they're extremely good at what they do because they have a long history of doing it well, they're also incentivized to continue to get better and stay as good as they can possibly be. And again, that competition is a good thing for them and us. It also means that because Microsoft has been the kind of de facto enterprise domain provider for so many years, Aber was talking a bit about, 20 years doing domain deployment, right? I mean, once you've managed to figure out in broad strokes how to deploy some domain controllers and keep your forest alive, at a certain point, there's not a ton more that they're adding through iterative upgrades to the server operating system platform anymore, other than the occasional benefit, like, Server 2016, we saw some Docker integration with containerization, things of that nature. But where they're really developing most of the on-prem and traditional domain capabilities now is in their ability to connect with and expand certain capabilities, certain Again, scaling out, scaling up, right? More demand for an increased frequency or amount of traffic, as well as being able to handle with heavier lifting, more demanding tasks, especially when those things have certain surge instances where suddenly we're having to do a lot more work, a lot more demand. But again, that's finite, that's temporary. And again, this elasticity of being able to expand into, say, the cloud to take care of an increased workload and then shrink back down again is an extremely compelling and cost-effective way to handle things. So comprehensive solutions, you can really treat Azure and all of its services as its own comprehensive suite of tools. A lot of organizations are completely abandoning on-premises infrastructure in light of the abilities that are now so vast and always on, always available, right? One of the other major benefits of migrating things into the cloud is those things are exposed or exposable over the internet to just about anywhere in the world. So it makes being tethered to a particular logical domain at a particular branch or office considerably less limiting. All right, now we can really have our users move to different locations and sort of seamlessly shift from place to place while still remaining fully connected if we care to set things up that way, or we can restrict things. Again, the other possibility here is that we can utilize cloud infrastructure as purely a backup or recovery solution as well. And some organizations still treat Azure as nothing more than a secondary site just in case, or treat their infrastructure is disaster recovery capacities rather than a secondary location, branch, or extension of their current capabilities. So one of the coolest things about the way they handle regions is that, one, they've made very certain that everything that happens within a region is going to be from a jurisdiction and applicable law vantage point relevant to that region, so that you don't have to worry that some applicable laws might be a little different depending upon where your data flows on any given day of the week. In the United States, if you were to utilize certain regions for your data, you're going to have to address a variety of different potential regulatory considerations. So, California's Privacy Act is pretty teethy, pretty strong language, and placing things, especially data, PII, out in a region in that location can have some significant regulatory and compliance ramifications. So being able to select a region that is both close to us from a latency perspective, but also that aligns with the jurisdiction and applicable laws that we either already grapple with or are willing and able to grapple with. Again, got to remember, when other people tell us that we have to do things, we have to factor in the risk inherent to doing or not doing those things. So when it comes to selecting a region, often the region is predicated on what we know we have to do from a compliance or legal perspective, maybe even a contractual obligation. Regions give us a lot of comparative granularity about where things end up. Within each of those regions, we've got availability zones. And within availability zones, we've also actually got these things called fault domains. Without going too far down that particular rabbit hole, very basically this means that they can update, they can change over, they can lose a power supply or a switch, and that usually would not, especially if you invest accordingly, cause you any significant downtime. So do you need to have that virtual machine running in 3 other different physical locations just in case? It's actually pretty easy to do, and it is considerably more cost beneficial than trying to replicate that with your own virtual infrastructure on-prem. You can also get a lot of default SLAs in this process. And what I mean by that is that your SLA guarantee often begins with a lot of resources they deploy with a 4.9 SLA by simply adding any amount of redundancy, paying for a secondary copy of certain resources, which is relatively easy in many cases, significantly shoots up the chances, decreases the chances of downtime. And so again, that uptime guarantee that they're providing with their service level agreement is an implicit part of utilizing and consuming their services. There's no contract you have to sign. This is just the promise they make along with the service you consume as part of your subscription. Azure resources are largely based on let me start that sentence over again. Back in the day when Azure was originally created, there were not resource groups. And resource groups very basically is just a bucket to put resources in. And resources are everything. Everything you create, anything with a name or properties is probably considered a resource. So everything originally really struggled in this ecosystem because it was just a list of stuff. So resource groups were generated as a kind of container to logically isolate and segment resources from one another. It also makes it a lot easier to manage them, migrate them, move them, even keep track of where you're spending your money from a metrics perspective. In addition, you can place certain types of locks on different resources and even resource groups so that significant accidental changes or malicious attacks are less likely to be successful. Further, you can tag resources. Now, that's just metadata, so there's no obligation to utilize tags. But again, one of the major benefits of adopting cloud service is that you can keep track of where your money's going. And one of the coolest things about utilizing tags in this fashion is that you can automatically mandate that certain resources get created with a tag no matter what. So you always want it to be the case that when your R&D folks are spinning up a test box, that they have to tag that as this is for beta purposes or something. And now there is always a tag, a searchable tag, and you can go find everything that's spun up and everything that's currently being utilized. You can see where your money's going, and their reporting capabilities, which we won't have a ton of time to get into here today, but their reporting capabilities are considerable. They want you to be able to utilize all these resources and a considerable number of panels and querying tools to get meaningful metrics extrapolated from all these resources you deploy. So it makes it really easy to make sure you're not spending too much money. That problem of sort of VM sprawl, where people spin up a bunch of virtual machines or other resources and just let them sit there running, eating money for no reason. It's far easier to tag your stuff and then run some periodic queries and scans to see if anything out there that's being utilized is unnecessary or cost ineffectual. What you do to start with Azure is you begin with an Azure account that then adopts one or more subscriptions. So your account is usually nested within a singular subscription. A subscription, is nested under an account, or an account owns that subscription. So I could theoretically subscribe to the standard pay-as-you-go model, which is the most typical model, especially for people starting out with Azure. That's where you pay for what you use, and then when you stop using it, you don't pay for it anymore. It's pretty straightforward. But there are other enterprise-grade subscriptions that you can lock into that have a variety of different potential benefits, cost-beneficial benefits if you're an educational institution or governmental, for example. And then you can establish management groups if the need arises to oversee multiple subscriptions. Now, for a lot of organizations, this is overkill. There's not a necessity here. But most of the time, subscriptions are considered a kind of logical demarcation for billing. So this is where you decide who's paying what money out. So you might have HR purchasing their own virtual infrastructure. I don't know, it's a possibility. And so you might ascribe a particular subscription to their department and have somebody managing it, just through that business unit. Whereas a lot of organizations have a singular subscription that covers all bases to keep things simple. If, however, you do need multiple subscriptions, normally there still needs to be a handful or at least a single administrative overseer that has access or knowledge of all of those subscriptions. So a management group allows you to organize multiple subscriptions under one broader umbrella, and you can actually set policies and certain types of rules at different tiers, at the management group tier, at the subscription group tier, and then at the resource group tier. So normally you would sign up and then you would have a subscription and you'd start building resources and put them into resource groups. But if you are large enough to warrant multiple subscriptions for whatever reason, then additionally, you might adopt a higher tier management group to manage subscriptions. And each subscription is its own billing boundary, as well as resource group boundary. So resource groups exist inside a particular subscription, but you can manage multiple subscriptions with a management group. Now, what can you do once you arrive in the Azure portal, the primary method for administering Microsoft Azure? Well, it can be a little overwhelming at first. It can even feel like just way more stuff than you could possibly manage at a time. And yet, there is an absolute crud ton of relatively straightforward resource that you can immediately start to take advantage of upon first connection. So I'm over here on my lab box. I'm connected to my live Azure account, and I just want to kind of walk you through the console here in brief, what's happening and where. First off, you can see up here in the upper right-hand corner that I'm currently logged in with my default Microsoft Trainer subscription. This is kind of a specialty subscription where they give it to those of us that train Microsoft courses. They give us a little credit so I can do things like the thing I'm doing right now without too much difficulty. So we've got my default subscription. I can, however, manage multiple subscriptions from this location or sign in and out. And then from the little gear icon here, I can set some additional settings. And here you can see that I have my default subscription, but I could manage other access to other subscriptions from this location, as denoted here under my directories and subscriptions section. Also, what they call blades, which is all the stuff that pops out with menu options here, they can also have their behavior and aesthetics change. And again, I don't want to waste a lot of time showing you how to make it look different, but you can see where, for example, we can collapse things automatically or can automatically move into an expanded view. There are light and dark options, language and regional considerations, personal information, and of course, you can sign out and move into a different subscription. Anytime a resource, is generated, you will almost always see any amount of feedback underneath here. Again, I'm eating up about 30 cents worth of resources each month right now with some things I'm running in the background. But otherwise, this is the $100 of credit they give me as part of my subscription. And especially if you are interested in a trial, they usually provide you that either with a student subscription or a trial subscription if you want to try Azure out for a little bit. And they'll give you some cash to play with in the Azure environment, as it were. So once I've kind of configured my console, my portal to look the way I prefer. And again, we're not going to get into this today, but you also note that Copilot has now been fully integrated into the portal. So that's also an available option. You can see some pretty usual suspects. You can see the ones that I tend to utilize are the most common options as well. Here we can manage deployed application services. Deployed application services, generally speaking, give me a fair amount of leeway in the platform as a service space, a specific I'll elaborate on here in just a moment. Then we've also got virtual machines, which is where I'm going to demonstrate things here in just a little bit as we talk more about the deployment of infrastructure in Azure specifically. So you can just kind of see where it's a pretty straightforward navigation. You've got a search bar if you want to find anything up at the top. Let's say you're looking to deploy an SQL database, for example. That's the easiest place to type and search. At this point in time, you can then see where I'm also getting a create button here in the upper left-hand corner, which is pretty standard navigation. And once I go to create any given resource, then I get a little walk-through graphical interface, not at all unfamiliar for those of us that have walked through any kind of installation process before, but this is fully integrated into the portal, and you can jump around often through different areas of the pre-configuration until you're done. Now, there are some exceptions to that. There are certain configurations that if you leave them dangling or don't complete them, it'll render a warning or won't let you proceed. But otherwise, again, pretty straightforward stuff. Well, there's a lot of available options that exist out there in this regard. Compute being one of the most popular and most well-regarded because, hey, at the end of the day, what you're mostly doing is renting compute services, right? You want to be able to generate virtual machines. You want to be able to deploy application services, and those are the two resources that I just touched upon there a moment ago. Again, I want to spin up an operating system with a certain amount of RAM and processing power, graphics capability. Perhaps I want to abstract things a little more. I don't want to have to worry about managing the underlying operating system. So instead, I go in and just say, hey, here's the code I want to run, you make it happen. And that's platform as a service in a nutshell. They just compel an underlying infrastructure to happen. You show up and provide the code, and it works. Azure Functions is what we often refer to as a serverless function, not literally, of course, but rather all server-related functionality is happening, but fully abstracted. And this allows for us to run certain types of predefined scripted behaviors. Not at all unfamiliar with, if you're not at all unfamiliar with scheduled tasks, this will not be a far cry. It's more capable, and it's more integratable to a lot of the different areas of Azure. So I don't mean to relegate it to purely a script runner, but it really is basically a glorified script running tool that doesn't necessitate that you go configure a particular server, system, or machine to provide that functionality. Thus, the moniker serverless. As far as virtual machines are concerned, again, you get to pick the amount of hardware you throw into them, how they're configured, as well as how, when, and where you deploy them. And the where of deployment, again, goes back to regions, data centers, potential requirements for redundancy, load balancing. You can also scale these up over time. So if you need to make them more powerful after a certain given window, you can do that, and you can do that with relative ease. And finally, managing them, well, again, a lot of the power of a tool like the Azure portal is the ability to have that single transparent pane of glass that shows you everything from one or a small handful of consoles. Now, compute doesn't get us very far unless we have some persistent storage. Not surprisingly, Microsoft provides us with standard storage, what some cloud providers call buckets or bit buckets, but what Azure calls blob storage for binary large object. And a binary large object storage area is just a place to dump your standard zeros and ones, your binary files. So anything that doesn't need to basically virtually replicate the standards of a disk, you can just throw them into this comparatively unstructured, more free-form, free-flowing, cheaper for them to keep blob storage. But you can get disk-level storage, and you can get disk-level storage deployed for virtual machines, so virtual disks. That's not listed here, but I did want to mention, like if you need a hard drive, you can also virtually define the size and type of hard drive that you need, and you can pick between spinning platter hard disk drives and solid state disks even. You can even pay way, way, way less money if you want to place things into cold storage and pay way less per gig, but way more for input output. So it would cost you way more to access it, but you're going to pay pennies on the dollar to keep it there, not literally, but considerably less to keep it there over time. As far as file storage is concerned, well, very basically, you can create a file share, SMB file share out there in the cloud, which sounds terrifyingly unsafe, but there are ways to actually generate file and folder storage and shares in a fashion that is fully encrypted. Remember, everything that happens through a browser is typically encrypted with HTTPS in today's world. So we actually benefit from a lot of those protections. SMB3 has come a long way since 2012 when it was originally deployed. You should look into the various aspects of security and encryption that are now enabled in this protocol. This isn't quite as terrifying and dangerous as it once would have been. Table storage for, usually the unstructured NoSQL, CosmoDB, MongoDB, and NoSQL, NoSQL are also available, as well as actual SQL databases if you need your full-bore SQL deployment. Queue or ephemeral storage is also available, and this is for things like messaging apps or temporary read writes that do not need to be written to permanent storage but need a temporary place to exist. Again, textbooks would refer to this as an ephemeral location for storage. Blob storage can be deployed as just a storage account for pretty much putting in any kind of binary file. Containers organize blobs into a hierarchy. Blobs store text or binary data of any kind. It's unstructured, which sounds bad, but that just means they can put it wherever and it's cost effective for them, so they can charge you less. And then you tag it with metadata. It looks and is accessible in a hierarchical fashion, but from their storage perspective, they're just dumping bits into buckets. They get to pass that savings along to you, and you still get valuable places to store your information. And yes, access controls along with robust encryption capabilities are available. As far as networking is concerned, well, this is the third, and again, you can't have one without the other two. But we have to have networking capabilities baked in here. And of course, we have to include virtualization capabilities for those underlying hardware components, which means we have virtual NICs, virtual switches, and virtual routing, as well as a myriad of other appliances that might contribute to load balancing, as well as a variety of different network services. Without getting into the particulars here, because this does get a little strange, just by having a Microsoft Azure account, you have an Entra database, and you've already got a presence there. You've got a kind of public presence on the internet by virtue of your Azure account. And you've already got a DNS server running quietly in the background that just exists because, as we know, directory services and name resolution requires DNS, so it's a prereq. But as far as network services are concerned in slightly more specific terms, what they're allowing us to do in this space is to allocate VPN connections for, say, tethering an on-prem branch into the cloud, or creating persistent peering connections so that I could have really, really fast, dedicated connections to two different network segments that might be stored in the same region or across the globe. And so the sheer vastness of customizability, again, assuming you're willing to pay, certainly certain things are more expensive than others. Persistent peered networks from, say, Japan to California, we're going to cost you a lot more, as well as the amount of traffic that you move back and forth over them. But the ability to take what would have otherwise been significant distances and very costly setups to connect and tether these systems, software-defined wide area networks, back-end, what we call Express Connect in some cases. You can directly connect into Microsoft's own back-end internet connectivity and bypass the internet entirely and just connect to them. Now, you have to be physically close enough to their data centers to buy into that service, but that's also an available option. And then, of course, what you would normally expect: virtual switches, virtual NICs, virtual routing. But Azure DNS, again, is baked in and already present. You don't even have to deploy your own discrete DNS server if you don't care to. You can just use the one provided. And it will automatically facilitate internet connectivity and resolve things to and from the internet for you. You can add robust, really stateless firewall-esque rules. What I mean by that is, Network security groups give us very rudimentary can and can't access control lists. You're allowed to do this, you can't do this other stuff. And as I said, load balancing is out there as well. So it's really easy to expand or limit the degree to which certain hosts are or are not exposed, as well as network segments. We can be very, very refined about how much bandwidth and how much speed is permitted for certain resources and the means by which we can connect to certain resources. And again, being able to hybridize, I think I misquoted. I think I said express connect. It's express route. Sorry. Now seeing it in print reminds me the proper term. They're not express connect, but express route, pardon me, is where you can connect locally into a local data center infrastructure instead of routing over the internet. And that's what a lot of their peering capabilities do as well, is where you can use Microsoft's connections, not the internet itself, to directly connect a variety of different pieces from, say, one data center in a region to another. So lots of possibilities. You can purchase public IP addresses. You can stay entirely private. So the exposure is really a matter of preference and need. Now, I don't want to spend too much time here because, frankly, this nuance is not particularly helpful in understanding the product much. But I do like to mention that if you start off with a brand new Azure account, you're going to have an Azure account that runs Azure, and then you're going to have Entra, which is a separate identity service for what you can do with the services in the cloud and who can access resources versus what can be done with Azure and managing Azure itself. Right. So if you're worried from an administrative perspective about who can spin up a resource or delete it, that's going to be your Azure role-based access control. If you're concerned about whether or not a person can log into their Office 365 mailbox, that's going to happen under the umbrella of the Entra identity. This is also the easiest place to synchronize your identities with an on-prem Azure, a standard Active Directory deployment, an LDAP standard deployment on-prem. And you can utilizing DirSync, which has now become several other things, but originally it was just DirSync. You'd run this little application on a member server on-prem, and it would periodically relay updates from the local domain identities into the cloud. It's gotten considerably better and a little bit more reliable than it once was. So again, for the most part, most people just run synchronization tools, or I've seen a lot more organizations starting to migrate to pure identity as a service, which means everything we do in terms of who you are and what you have access to is decided out there in Azure. And then we manage this single location of identities instead of worrying about things on-prem. Now, that is a huge undertaking if you are historically used to more of the more of the available local options that give you a whole lot more local control. And again, you can reach out and touch the stuff you're managing. Whereas when you're migrating into Azure, you lose a lot of that direct oversight. The auditability, the reviewability of a lot of things is lost in the abstraction of the cloud. So that is definitely a risk consideration that you would want to factor in during any potential migration considerations. Single sign-on can be easily maintained with Azure Entra. Basically, again, log in one time, get access to all your stuff is made possible. Just like I log into my domain, I can open up file shares and emails. Well, the same is true within your Entra identity. And that's what makes an identity as a service a potentially compelling option. Multi-factor, although I won't get into the particulars, but don't go expecting that all the really good security services will be readily available to you unless you're willing to pay for premium Entra services. If you're very serious, though, about investing in Entra, the free tier is barely functional for doing anything meaningful in an enterprise capacity. You got to go to premium tier 1 at least to start to get the adequate security features and controls you're going to want. Conditional access, another really cool feature that allows us to set up a series of attributes that determine when you're connecting, from where you're connecting, who you are, what groups you're a member of, and even the nature and status of the thing you're trying to access to determine right then and there if now's an okay time. Again, role-based access control is more of your owner, contributor, reader stuff. And that's, again, administering and managing Azure itself and less the resources within Azure. And again, the available specific permissions and rights for managing and overseeing the resources once deployed. Most of the time, we generate resource groups in order to do a lot of this stuff. So what I want to do now is just briefly mention the creation, illustrate the creation of a resource group. And again, it's not very exciting because it's kind of the equivalent of creating a group and then populating that group with things once you bother. But what I want to show you is the relationship of a resource group to then deploying resources. So I'm going to go through and deploy a resource group, then I'm going to deploy a virtual machine, and that's pretty much going to take us to the end of our time here. So before I move fully out of our overview slides, I just want to very briefly mention a couple of other side notes before we again get fully into demo, and then I take questions. The Security Center is another place that is getting a lot of increasing effort and function and utility, a lot more integrated cyber threat intelligence capabilities, compliance checklists, and governance/compliance querying tools. So being able to instantiate an appropriate baseline of security and then go, hey, does this match up with the stuff we're supposed to be doing? Way easier than it once was. For a lot of organizations, this has become the difference between, I don't really know what the risks are, to the transparency and ease of articulating the risks related to Azure and utilizing its services. Much easier, much more streamlined than it once was. From an Azure management perspective, you've seen me use the portal, although you can also utilize a bunch of different on-prem tools. Depending upon what part of Azure you're managing, you can do pretty much everything from PowerShell. You can administer through PowerShell by authenticating remotely over the network, and then you can run PowerShell commands against it. You can also download a dedicated Azure command line tool. And there are actually several command line interfaces in the Azure portal that you can utilize. And they very basically are light versions of Linux's Bash, born again shell for Azure administration. And then one that's considerably more similar to PowerShell, and it's basically PowerShell for Azure. So you have Bash and PowerShell designed specifically for integration and use in the PowerShell context. You can also use, if you're familiar, RESTful transactions over the REST API. And there are several specific consoles for things like backups and file management, where you can do a lot of local graphical tools for backup and management of high availability and resiliency concerns. Now, that doesn't even scratch the surface of the higher level enterprise grade mix and match when you start talking about having your own data center with cloud services and hybridizing into part of or entirely into Azure infrastructure as well. And again, there we start to just get bonkers in terms of the numbers of possibilities. So deploying a web app with Azure Application Services is also, again, something a lot of organizations are interested in, largely because you get to go, hey, I have this code. Here's the kind of code it is. It's Java, or if it was built in, I know I'm totally blanking, Python, Ruby, something like that, C. And then we deploy the code, and then we can test and verify the code. And this operates in fantastic support of your standard DevOps environments, especially for continuous integration and continuous development and deployment. So, given that takes us to the end of our overview, and we had a great kind of brief chat right at the beginning. I don't want to totally run out the clock, just to demonstrate a couple of simple things before we're done. But I also want to leave you a moment to ask any questions that might be left. So let's do this. Let's move over into just a very brief demonstration, and then I will give you just a couple of minutes for Q&A. And hopefully then everybody will be sufficiently edified to go forth in Azure. So what again I want to illustrate here is the creation of a resource group. Now here you can see over here on the right where I can generate a resource via clicking on the resource group icon, but I could have searched for it up here, or I could have come over here to the left-hand menu and selected the resource group blade instead. Per Microsoft, there's always half a dozen ways to get to the same place, right? And I would create a resource group by simply giving it a name and affiliating it with one of my current subscriptions, in this case, my MSDN Microsoft Trainer subscription. I would simply give this a test name for demo, and then where in the world do I want it to go? So again, there are a whole bunch of regions. You'll notice that it's listing the ones it believes I would most likely deploy to because of past behaviors and my current physical location, though there are other options I could select from if I was really dying to. Right? I'm going to go with the West Coast, West Central US, and simply review and create. Nice thing about resource groups, by the way, they don't cost you anything. There's no cost affiliated. I can leave this indefinitely, but it doesn't do much of anything, all right, until I have, and it's got to finish deploying here. We'll see if I can get it to do that fast enough. As though I get to decide how fast anything works here. Here we go. Test name for demo, it appeared. And again, by the way, folks, in the upper right-hand corner, it will tell you how far along a resource deployment is so that you can simply click on it as a shortcut to get back to it at any time if need be. So here again, there's not much to show you because there's not much in here, but I did want to mention this is also where you could see a tag, which is just a name pair. So I could say, you know, maybe this is department IT. And again, tags also don't cost you anything. So you can label things to your heart's content, making them that much easier to find down the road. Now, once I have a resource group, I can populate it with resources. So let's create a simple virtual machine here just to have something inside that particular resource group. I'll create a standard VM. And you'll notice the first thing it asks me is to place it in a resource group. This is not optional. I have to put it in a resource group and give it a name. Now, I can deploy it in the same region as the resource group, but I don't have to. So usually you want to keep things from just a keeping track of it administratively perspective. I find it's easier to place things in the same region as the resource group they're in, latency, etc. But there are obviously going to be scenarios where there might be a good reason to change that. High availability options. We don't have time to get into all of the particulars here, but you can see virtual machine scale sets and availability sets, which give you an increased opportunity to commit larger sets of copies, backups, and make for redundant backend copies for purposes of failover in the event of any kind of outage. This is going to utilize things like fault and update domains so that if they lose a power supply, you don't go offline. If they need to do some proactive updating, that they're not having to take infrastructure down that impact your SLA. We can also decide whether or not it's trusted, which has to do with some of the baked-in encryption capabilities they've included. Whole bunch of Linux options here in this Windows console. Just never thought I'd see that, but here we are. And if we scroll down a little ways, we can see most of the, not all, usually the bleeding edge stuff is still on-prem only. So we're only seeing Server 2022 at the moment, although I'm confident we'll start seeing some of the other newer products populate here soon. It's only been fairly recently that Windows 11 was an available virtual machine. Also, if you have been utilizing Microsoft Hyper-V for some time, we only recently switched over to Gen 2 VMs on the Azure side of things, which has been a refreshing change. Anyway, all this to say, I can then set up usernames, passwords. I can also allow for access, things like remote desktop, or if this was, for example, a Linux box, more likely I would configure it with remote secure shell. From here, I could then go in and stipulate the disks, how big those disks are going to be. Remember, we also said that we can decide on whether or not it's a solid state disk or a hard disk drive. We can decide on encryption, whether or not there is an encryption key and where that disk exists. And if I want to add my own secondary volumes for whatever reason. Under networking, here I can assign whatever IP address out of a given subnet, or even a public IP address if I care to have one, so that I can expose this directly to the internet. And then management, monitoring, and some tagging capabilities. Obviously things that you could get way into the weeds on this. But given that we are at the end of our hour, that I think is as much as we can probably manage to illustrate here, the time allotted. I'm hopeful that that was at least somewhat edifying in terms of what Azure is capable of and what it can do. Before we depart, are there any questions or anything else about this process that I could clarify or leave you with a better impression for what it can or can't do as far as adoption and migration is concerned?
I think the only question I got, you answered some of it with the demonstration, but adding a virtual machine, because I deal with the virtual machines on the side, on the help desk side. So when I'm creating a new virtual machine, is it the name, the hardware's name that goes into that machine or is it the MAC address? I'm not sure what would actually go into that name.
When you're dealing with virtual hardware, all MAC addresses are effectively generated automatically by Microsoft. Microsoft has a series of MACs. So if you're worried about like the organizationally unique identifier, that OUI, the first half of the MAC address, they have a predefined one that they assign to the NICs of the virtual machines you deploy there. And if memory serves, you can make those static, though. Boy, I'm not confident enough to say that definitively. I think there's a way to assign a static MAC address to a virtual NIC, but I'd have to peel back a couple of pages to confidently confirm as much.
I'm using thin client. So the thin client, the RJ45 that it plugs into, that hardwired Mac we wouldn't use. It'd be the ones that Azure is generating.
Exactly. Yeah, because you are effectively, it's a thin client, right? So the only thing you'd have to worry about with MAC addresses would be like anything on-prem from an authentication perspective. So if you're doing any kind of AAA on-prem from a thin client, you might still have network access control stuff to worry about on a local switch. But the actual authentication of a product and its access, it's all taking place in Azure remotely, and you are merely connecting to it. Although you can generate personal desktops that can be accessed in Azure. There's an entire virtual desktop infrastructure capability that can either be an extension of an existing VDI deployment from on-prem, or you can add a brand new one. And again, it's really neat because you can basically set it up to where people's desktops are in the cloud permanently. So again, it sucks if your internet connection goes down, but otherwise you are perpetually able to get into your desktop account by virtue of that. But circling back to your original question, yes, that would be a virtual appliance that would exist on that virtual remote network. And you would, the only thing with consideration to a MAC address that you might have to address is maybe like, I don't know, possible local appliances that you want to add somehow, but very rarely do local MAC addresses make much of a consideration here because you're moving different network segments anyway. So there's always going to be a router in between that segment and whatever you're probably connecting it to. Chances are pretty good MACs aren't going to factor in from an authentication perspective.
Question answered.
Anything else, gang? I remember the last time I ended a webinar right at the 60-minute marker. I can't shut up soon enough. But anyway, sorry, I don't mean to run anybody too long here today. Well, let me make sure that you're walking out the door here with my contact information. So here again, my name is Jarrett Heinz. You are always, always, always more than welcome to reach out. I've just thrown my credentials there in the chat, but also you can scan QR code if you'd like to reach out and communicate with myself. And of course, the folks at support at training camp, no, I guess actually, if you've already got or you've initiated your class with them, support at trainingcamp.com, and then trainingcamp.com for any additional customer service or any kind of queries about our forthcoming Azure offerings. I'm not the best place to go to ask about courses that are on the schedule currently. That's going to be, head over to our website for that stuff, but I can definitely clarify, what's in this class, what should I expect, what should I prepare for, anything, especially if you're having any pre-class jitters or anxieties. I'm always a place you can get some clarification and maybe a little bit of comfort moving into your class that's coming up or something along those lines. But please don't hesitate to reach out if there's something that I can do to make things less ambiguous. And that's with whether or not it's a course offering from Training Camp or just an Azure detail in general. I'm always happy to be a resource there too. Well, thanks everybody for taking some time out of your Friday afternoon. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. And again, want to make sure that everybody knows we're always happy to answer any questions about these processes. So please feel free to reach out. Have a great rest of your Friday and enjoy your weekend. And we'll see you next time at Training Camp.
Awesome. Thanks, Jared.